Today, I'm not going to tell you the story of a country, because this story isn't about a country at all. It's about a system that includes you too. And that system is far more disturbing than you think. In the world of the 1970s, there was a country whose citizens traveled to the United States and went shopping, saying, "Not one, give me two." People carried suitcases full of cash, bought gasoline cheaper than water, and believed the future was automatically guaranteed. And now stop. Right here, I want you to think for just 1 second. If a country is this rich, why are millions of people trying to escape it today? This video is about the possibility that this wealth may have never truly existed, and even worse. This story is not unique to Venezuela. If you stay until the end, you won't just understand why economic crises seem to explode all of a sudden, but why they often feel as if they were planned long in advance. In the mid-1970s, anyone walking through the streets of Florida, especially inside the luxury shopping malls of Miami, would encounter a strange sight during a time when the United States itself was struggling economically. High-end jewelry stores, luxury car dealerships, and electronic shops were not filled with Americans, but with Venezuelan families who were not only wealthy, but absolutely convinced that this wealth was permanent. At the time, Florida shop owners even gave these Venezuelans a nickname, Dame Dos, meaning, "give me two." Because when a Venezuelan liked a product, they almost never bought just one. They wanted two, one for themselves and one for someone else, without even bothering to ask the price. These people didn't carry credit cards, but suitcases filled with cash dollars, freshly printed banknotes withdrawn from banks in Caracas, were left as tips on restaurant tables, and products that Americans needed months of work to afford were purchased in a single afternoon, creating a scene that felt almost surreal to the average American of the time. Back in Caracas, the situation was no different. The city was being rebuilt from the ground up, skyscrapers were rising, highways were expanding, and a consumer culture unlike anything else in Latin America was emerging, so much so that Caracas was the only city in South America where the Concorde landed regularly. At this point, the story needs to slow down, because the only way to understand what looked like a fairy tale of prosperity from the outside is to ask a simple question. Where was this wealth really coming from, and how solid were its foundations? The answer, as everyone knew, was oil. When the Yom Kippur War broke out in 1973, Arab oil producers imposed an embargo on the West, and oil prices nearly quadrupled overnight. This triggered one of the largest transfers of wealth in history from industrialized nations to oil-producing countries. Venezuela wasn't just lucky during this period. It was also one of the founding members of OPEC, and ironically, one of the architects of OPEC itself was a Venezuelan, Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, who famously described oil as the devil's excrement, and warned years in advance that this sudden wealth would rot the country from the inside. But by 1974, no one was in the mood to listen to warnings. Money was flowing, projects were starting, and for the first time in Venezuela's history, the idea of limitless possibilities had spread across every layer of society. Sitting in the presidential palace at the time was Carlos Andrés Pérez, a charismatic and energetic leader who genuinely believed that with oil revenues he could turn Venezuela into a first-world country within a decade. And most of the population shared that belief. The oil industry was nationalized, PDVSA was created, massive infrastructure projects were launched, one of the largest hydroelectric dams in the world was built, and tens of thousands of young Venezuelans were sent to universities in the United States and Europe on government scholarships. From the outside, it all looked like a carefully planned development strategy. But now I need to pull you a little deeper into the story, because this is the exact moment when the invisible mechanism that would determine Venezuela's fate quietly came into play, and almost no one noticed. Did you know that the country with the largest proven oil reserves in the world is not Saudi Arabia, but Venezuela? With approximately 303 billion barrels, Venezuela ranks first, while Saudi Arabia follows with 267 billion. Yet the similarity between these two countries ends almost entirely with those numbers. Because not all oil is the same. Saudi Arabia's oil is light, fluid, and close to the surface. Extracting a barrel costs only a few dollars, allowing production to continue even when prices fall, meaning it hurts, but the system survives. Venezuela's oil, on the other hand, is extra heavy, thick like tar buried deep underground, and requiring advanced technology, diluents, and massive costs to extract, a difference that becomes fatal when oil prices decline. Here, I want you to pause and think. If a country's wealth depends entirely on a period of high prices, and its entire system is built around that assumption, what remains when prices fall? Throughout the 1970s, Venezuela rapidly slid into the economic trap known as Dutch disease. An influx of foreign currency overvalued the local currency, agriculture and manufacturing collapsed, production became meaningless, and the country turned into a consumption economy that imported nearly everything. But the real danger came when oil revenues were no longer enough, and the country began borrowing. American and European banks were overflowing with petrodollars deposited by OPEC countries and needed to lend that money somewhere, and Venezuela appeared to be the perfect borrower, politically stable and sitting on enormous oil reserves. Bankers flew into Caracas, presenting the idea that oil prices would rise forever almost as a scientific certainty, pulling Venezuela deeper into a debt spiral through variable interest loan agreements, details that seemed insignificant at the time. When the U.S. Federal Reserve sharply raised interest rates in the early 1980s, and oil prices simultaneously began to fall, the economic structure Venezuela had built for years started collapsing mathematically, with no remaining buffer to stop it. In February 1983, on what became known as Black Friday, the bolivar was devalued, and Venezuelans became poorer overnight. Years of perceived prosperity were replaced by deep insecurity and anger. In 1989, when IMF-backed austerity measures eliminated subsidies, the Caracazo riots that erupted in the streets of Caracas were not just economic protests, but a raw expression of a broken social contract. And the moment the state turned its weapons on its own people marked a point of no return. This environment paved the way for figures like Hugo Chavez to rise, because people had come to believe that the old system had deceived them, intentionally or not, and for the first time, the question of whether oil wealth truly belonged to the people was asked out loud. Today, the real motivation behind Saudi Arabia's efforts to diversify its economy through projects like Vision 2030 goes far deeper than modernization. It is rooted in a profound fear of one day experiencing what Venezuela did, of becoming Saudi Venezuela. And as we close this story, I want to ask you one final thing. Do not see Venezuela's collapse as a result of poverty or bad luck, because this country did not collapse because it was poor, but because it believed wealth alone would save it. This may look like a story about Venezuela, but in reality, it applies to every country where the balance between wealth, debt, and governance has been broken. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all is this: which countries are making the same mistake today?